Well, thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for that introduction. My former colleague, Bray Patrick Lake, is who helped kick off the inaugural conference. She's also a member of the Screen Actors Guild. So if you're a member, don't compare how dynamic she is compared to me. But I am, as was mentioned, here's just a quick disclaimer. CTTI, or CITI, you'll hear me slip in and out of calling it CITI as well, is a public-private partnership started by Duke and the FDA, and really was started because of challenges that were happening in the clinical trial space. And people would be at these meetings. Our original executive director of our executive committee was in meetings with the FDA, and he's like, what can we do? And the original idea is that we would do so well that we wouldn't need to exist for much longer. We were hopeful for that, but we have been around for over 15 years, so we keep finding new things to work on, and really are moving more into how do we help people doing the things that we're recommending, which is what we'll be talking about a lot tomorrow. But as mentioned, we're a public-private partnership, which means we have an FDA grant, and we also have member organizations. And those member organizations, it's over 75. They are our main connection, and they also, when I say we, city, I'm including them. So it's our staff plus that city member organizations, and they help us conduct projects, they vote on projects, we also get suggested projects from the US FDA. And because of that startup from the FDA, we also, our projects do mainly focus on medical product studies that would be registrational clinical trials, but you can't talk about clinical research without, also including post-approval studies and other things that might not be regulatory focused. But at our organization, we have always wanted, and we have built a system where all parties have an equal voice. And last night at dinner, we were talking about that a little bit more, that we're better at that now than maybe the very beginning. Our equal voice to start was, 2 or 3 representatives on our steering committee were patients or caregivers. But through the years, pretty quickly in the first 5 years of our development, we elevated patients or patient groups to one of our set of team leads on projects. So we usually have government, industry, academia, and a patient or patient advocacy group as team leads. There's patients on the committee, but everybody has an equal seat, equal voice in participating in our projects, participating in our meetings, and we're very intentional about including everybody at all of those stages. This is our membership, so you can see that multi-stakeholder nature. We have industry, we have government groups and agencies in the US. We have patient advocacy organizations who are members and have representatives on our steering committee, our academic groups, and then we have trade organizations and sort of our miscellaneous at the bottom. We've developed some more tech members or platform members in the last couple years as the decentralized trial space has grown. And a little bit more, so when I'm saying things like executive committee, steering committee, all of that, this is what I mean. We have an executive committee that provides strategic direction and oversight. Our steering committee is that last slide where you saw all those organizations. They all have one representative on our steering committee. That representative is in charge of the liaison between city and that organization. So sometimes they participate in projects, but we really rely on them to find the people in their organization who would want to participate in projects or participate in a recommendations advisory committee or attend an expert meeting. And we also rely on our member organizations to implement our recommendations, so that we found that's our most successful way of getting someone to implement is if they help develop the recommendations in the first place. And then our staff, we've got a staff of just under 20 people that's operational support. We also have, being part of an academic institution, we have the benefit of part-time people who are on a social science team that conducts research, and also sometimes operational staff from our larger clinical research institute. So this is our portfolio of all the work that we've conducted over the years. And we organize our website. If you've been to our website, this is how it's organized. We are revamping our website, so it may look different soon, but we really organize it around these different. Quality is always primary. You can't read our recommendations without seeing mention of quality, and it's in our mission, develop and drive adoption of practices to increase the quality and efficiency of clinical trials. We've got a digital health trials portfolio that started in 2014. At the time, that was lots of talk today about changes in terminology. It was called mobile clinical trials when it started. Now it's digital health trials. And we did some follow-on work there as well when we saw how much that had expanded during the pandemic. So we updated those recommendations on decentralized trials and novel endpoints during and they just got re-released in 2022. We always have an eye towards new and interesting things. So are there new types of studies? Lots of these have been mentioned today, and that's in this category. You'll also notice terminology differences there, large simple trials, pragmatic trials. When we did that project years ago, it was when the TASTE trial had first came out, and we were referring to it more often as large simple trials. And sometimes we focus our efforts on particular areas of clinical research that are really challenging, like antibacterial drug development, and that's also where the FDA can ask us to do projects. They asked us to do some projects around that, and that's where the early consent work came in, looking at, could you ask patients at risk for hospital-acquired or ventilated or associated pneumonia up front? So a lot of what we're talking about today, so it's some of a preliminary to that, how could you ask patients if they're okay with research even before they might be eligible? And you can see some of our trials in clinical practice, what I'm talking about today. And then you see we have less projects in the ones below, but patient engagement, as I mentioned, it does not mean we don't focus on patient engagement. It just means it's part of everything that we do. So we had the particular project that's been mentioned that was part of your inaugural meeting. And that project, I don't have slides about that today, but there was a pre-read that was sent out to everybody here that had your chevron diagram that was from our project. So engaging patients and patient groups early and often across that continuum. And we also have a collaboration with the FDA for the Patient Engagement Collaborative, and that's 16 people who go through an application process to inform the FDA and city about how to interact with patients in a more effective way, and they are often asked to respond to materials that might be coming out and those kinds of things. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but I won't belabor this one anymore. As I mentioned, we do create recommendations. I'm here today to talk about the trials and clinical practice recommendations. And we do that with our multi-stakeholder teams, and we really strive to create actionable, evidence-based, consensus-driven recommendations. And they fall in these different categories. Some accelerate study startup times, some leverage new technologies, some enhance the quality of clinical trials, and there's other times that we're streamlining strategies to meet regulatory requirements. So we've had projects where the FDA may have put out something that said, really, you don't have to collect all of this data, but people still send it to them. So they may ask us to conduct a trial where we do research to find out why are you still sending all of this data? So it's to help people follow maybe guidance documents that the FDA is okay with, but maybe they didn't, people aren't implementing it. And then we have our Transforming Trials 2030, which came out in 2020, so we had 10 years when we came out with it, and our new website will be arranged a little bit more like this. And this is now our North Star of trying to achieve all of these pillars that you see in the round circles. The star on fully integrated is because what I'm talking about today is that piece. But we also have patient-centered and easily accessible, designed with a quality approach right in the center, because we've been doing work on that since the beginning of our organization. maximally leveraging all available data, again, very relevant today, and the overarching improving population health. And we have a new project that was just launched this year where we're developing metrics on how to say, how are we achieving this? So we have a project team that is trying to figure out what is there already and how can we measure the clinical trials space and whether we're achieving these goals. So with that, I can stop if anyone has any general city questions. Is there anything that anybody wanted before I jump right into our trials and clinical practice recommendations?
How many hospitals or sites or centers, and how do they connect with city? Understand, like in Canada, I would sort of understand, but HMOs and a trial would be rolled out in how many places? And
Yeah, we don't conduct trials ourselves. Oh, yeah, we're doing projects on trying to improve clinical trials. We have, I don't know the exact number, we can go back to our, here we go. This slide about, that next to last on the bottom is the, we have some of the major academic medical centers in the country, but the other thing, we always include anybody who is an expert. So even if they're not a member, we will, when we're creating project teams, if someone is outside of our member organizations, but they are the expert on whatever we're working on, we would go and reach out to them. They don't have to be a member, and people can participate even if they're not members. It's just that's the group that we most closely interact with and get our, are on our listserv, those kinds of things, but anybody can do it. Any other general city questions? All right. All right, so Trials in Clinical Practice was a project that we started in 2021. So earlier, the pandemic had started, but we hadn't quite started the project. This was something that our membership voted on as something they wanted to work on. And really what we've heard of lots today, this morning sessions and the early afternoon beautifully played into what we're talking here. We want clinical care and clinical research to be more intertwined, and so that we can have that more generalizable and relevant evidence. And who would benefit from this and the case for it. And you can see some of these things have been demonstrated in case studies that have done embedded trials, but a lot of them are still the ideal, and we're working towards, if we can fully implement clinical trials into clinical practice, then you would be achieve some of these things. So the most paramount, and it's why it's the first column, is patients. So, research and care being better aligned, allowing patients to not have to go to separate visits or separate activities and get as many as possible involved in their clinical care or collected through clinical care. So with the idea that would be less burdensome to participate. And also if it's in clinical care, and that means also including not just those major, and we saw lots of pictures of that today of how research centers and then the rest of the country, and that's true in the United States. There's something like 2/3 of the country that's over 2 hours away from the big academic medical centers. So we really need ways to be in the community as well so that we can get greater diversity and inclusivity. And again, more real life experiences, because it's what's happening all the time, not just in the research setting. Again, providers wanting to engage in research, but finding ways to do that with minimal burden. I think the recovery trial, and a little bit of that was shown today with the providers saying how much they liked participating in research. Most providers, if given the opportunity, or the last panel just said, if you make it part of people's job, then people would want to do it, but they don't want to do it if it's going to be extra or volunteer or on top of their already really burdened jobs. And you really want to address clinically meaningful questions. And again, this morning, with the uncertainty, doctors don't often admit how much they don't know. You all know that, like to patients, but the more evidence we have, you can better inform care. And also be able to see patients in different ways. So optionality for patients can also make providers give more options to patients in that way. So sponsors, again, have more generalizable evidence, hopefully not find things post-market if you're doing these pre-market, if you have more generalizable evidence in the first place. Insights into implementations and interventions, and also the potential for increased efficiency. So really this is one, and cost savings by reducing that duplication of effort. This is one where we aren't quite there yet. If you're having to build the systems and infrastructure, there's an investment at first, but the hope is that you would realize that. And same with regulators and payers and health system leaders. These ones fall into our high-level policy recommendations, but really they're also interested in getting really good quality data, having more diverse patient populations, understanding how to make payment care decisions, at least whether that's your government's healthcare system or your individual insurance providers. And so you can see that. And then with the health system leaders, really a selling point could be getting more patients to come. If you're known as providing cutting edge care, that patients could decide to come see you for that reason. All right. So before we dive completely into the recommendations, we have done a lot of work, and I mentioned that a little bit with that slide with our whole portfolio over the years that really paved the way for this work. And it's also a lot of people have come before us, and some of these were mentioned earlier today, the National Academies Drug Forum, the FDA Real World Evidence Framework, the NIH Collaboratory, and their collaboration with PCORI. Veterans Affairs has been doing really interesting research for a long time. The Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and something that is ongoing now is ACT at POC, which that's point of care trials, and they are really targeting the people involved in that initiative are health systems. So trying to get that last piece of those health systems providers to buy in and participate in clinical research. And our work at Citi, we started with quality by design back in one of our very first projects, trying to look at what matters, only collecting the most critical data and putting all of your effort into getting high quality data for those most critical factors. Registry trials we did in the mid-2010s. And again, that was right around the time that wasn't quite everyone using real-world data yet, but it was one of the types of real-world data. Those are recs for designing registries to meet FDA review expectations. So we really had in the US still, the device industry is much better at this. They have done this and have gotten labeling extensions and things, and so we had a lot of team members from the device side who were really trying to pull along the rest of the landscape to get acceptance of this as well. We collaborated with Harvard Pilgrim and the FDA on the Sentinel project, which this uses both health systems and payer data to conduct a clinical trial about anticoagulation, and using the primary endpoints from the pharmacy and claims data to see if we were able to get more patients with AFib on anticoagulants. And then again, real world data. This sort of gets at the first stage that you'll see of the elements that can be embedded, really using that real world data, electronic healthcare data to evaluate trial eligibility and criteria to enhance recruitment. And because I refer to it so much, I want to make sure people know what I'm talking about. Our quality by design work this is an approach that focuses on reducing errors that matter to decision making. So do that by creating a culture that values quality, slowing down in the design process so that you can go faster and don't have to do amendments and don't have to find out things that you didn't realize in your planning. So you have that open dialogue, critical thinking, what are your critical factors? This is engaging all stakeholders in trial design, but also in all phases of clinical development. And then really identifying those critical to quality factors. So what are the things that if they aren't accurate, if they aren't collected, if they're missing, are going to ruin your trial? And those are the things you should put your effort and resources towards. And all of these are available on our website. So if you want to look more at our quality by design, and we've had 2 projects and a number of workshops on this, they're available on our website. We have an ongoing project right now called Engaging Stakeholders in Trial Design, and we were talking about this last night about how hard it is to get people to implement something new, but also even if people are bought in and they're excited, but how do you get them to do it? Or they don't know how. They're like, how do we do this? So we're developing an engagement roadmap to gather other people's resources, other companies, ours and others, to really walk people through, at least in that trial design phase, how do you engage everybody? And that includes patients and caregivers, investigators and sites, regulators, IRBs, technology, and payers. So our current project, or our project I'm here to talk about today, embedding trials in clinical practice, we did this to facilitate the integration of clinical trials intended for, but not limited to, those medical products review. So that was registrational. You'll see a couple other places where we refer to them as registrational clinical trials, and embedding those into clinical practice. So we focus both on operations and on randomized trials with US sites, but because this is more common in places that have nationalized healthcare, we did also include global trials as well. And we really wanted to look at, you can see the objectives there, I won't read those out, but this funnel shows you how we conduct every city project, but the things that we do that then we distill down into the recommendations that were sent out prior to this meeting. So we have evidence gatherings or interviews, we had we also collected case examples. We then had an expert meeting where we gather more people than the people who are involved in our project to comment on those things. And then we also get some fresh eyes on it, our multi-step stakeholder review, the team discusses more, and we come out with these recommendations. So it's not fast, but that's how we get our consensus-driven recommendations. So the in-depth interviews for this, we talked to, we did a qualitative descriptive study. That's where our social science team came in for this. And we did in-depth interviews, and it was an iterative process where we first did sponsors and leaders in the clinical trial space. Some had done registrational trials and some were non-registrational trials. And then we looked at those results, we started to collect case studies, and then we went and interviewed people who have implemented trials into clinical practice, and did a formal thematic analysis, and really looked at why people want to do this. So you can tell that chart I showed in the beginning is where we got a lot of that, was what are the motivations? What are the barriers, and how do we overcome those barriers, or how did they overcome the barriers in the trials that they were conducting? So these are the top ones. We heard other things, but these are the top things that came through on the interviews. So we heard a lot that people want to use that health systems approach. They want to allow for rigorous evaluation of treatment, but in a real-world setting. So, in other words, enables pragmatic trials. And they want research to be more cost-effective. So they want it to use data that is already captured. And that was mentioned this morning as well, how much money goes into collecting data for a clinical trial. So if you can use another source, it ideally would cut a lot of costs. Barriers, as you know, I've mentioned it, it's been mentioned today too, clinicians have limited time and limited incentives to participate. So if you're on a research track, that's your job and you may do that, but we often have people that are more clinical track and maybe a few people that are in between, but your standard frontline clinicians don't have a lot of time to do this. Lack of leadership buy-in, and that can both be from health systems, but also just the willingness to try things new. So it might be your academic healthcare leaders, it might be your pharma or device or bio companies that are nervous to try something like this, especially for registrational trials. And data systems. So again, the last panel was fantastic, talking about like both how do you, if you need to, alter your system to collect something, but then actually get people to collect it, and then get it rolled up into your data warehouse if that's what you're doing, or into your electronic data capture system. And that's where that interoperability, especially where we have so many different systems. We have two major and some minor electronic healthcare companies in the US, and are the two interoperable? Can you roll them up? All of those things come into play. And then everybody builds their own system. So are they using standards across them to collect things? But we did hear that, in order to overcome these things, either people have done these things or it's what is needed. You need a cultural shift. You want to make clinical practice and clinical care more integrated. You also want healthcare buy-in and engagement, and again, so getting those healthcare systems involved. You want to reduce the burden and minimize the negative impact on everyone involved. You want to invest in research infrastructure and manage, again, as I already mentioned, manage that interoperability. So there's lots of efforts out there to get data more standardized in healthcare, and that's only going to help with, once you fix that governance provenance piece, then the standards should help with that as well. So these are just some examples of what we heard from our interviewees. So this was a registrational trial implementer, and really making that point that, some places clinical trials are optional. I mean, they're always going to be optional. We will get informed consent. He wasn't suggesting that, I don't think. But it needs to be a different perspective. Access to clinical trials is providing the best clinical care, as opposed to just being something that some centers do and other centers don't. And they're trying to recognize that, and that patients, if they see the advantage of that, and again, the last panel talked about if patients have a choice and they know they can get cutting edge care somewhere and they have the ability to pay for it, they may choose that. So we want to recognize that there's value in this, and that and how that can do that, especially though if we can do it effectively. But there is so much education required. So we're not trying to say that we should just flip a switch and that everybody will just be able to do this. There's so much education required, getting people's buy-in of patients, providers, leadership, pharmacy. Everybody has to be on board so this can run seamlessly. And if it's not going to run seamlessly, then people aren't going to try it again. So we have to build that infrastructure. And then again, this speaks to clinical burden and burden on our clinical providers. So we're asking them to do what they are not normally doing in most cases. And that if we're going to tie things to the clinical flow, we need to make that as less, reduce the burden as much as possible. Really, can we do it where they document things the way they normally would? So as much as you can integrate it into existing care, the better it's going to be. And that this does not mean that you would get rid of your clinical research team. This person who was a sponsor talked about how they put their most senior people on it. And, some of the trials that were so successful during COVID did that as well. Had support people who were experienced in clinical research helping in implementation. All right, so that brings us to the actual recommendations. And when we designed these, and as we were talking to people, we really did see this need to split them up into different types of recommendations. So there's the initial trial design and methodology. Then there's operational, like how do you make it happen once you've decided you can do it and it's appropriate, but then how do you actually implement it? So those operational factors. And then those overarching items, those healthcare and research culture, and how do we get those things to be less separate and get everybody motivated to work together to do this. And so some of those are more policy type recommendations. So the one thing too to talk about, and for we talked about overwhelm, is that it does not have to be all or nothing, that first recommendation. You can gain the benefits of clinical trials and clinical practice, even if you're only doing the things that are feasible for your trial. So if you picked like 3 of these, but still were collecting some things in a normal clinical trials way, that might be a way either to get people comfortable and maybe you could do more fully integrated, or it might just be what's feasible and you could do less data collection. So we really wanted to stress that it's not an all or nothing, and that's our very first recommendation, and to really sensibly think, and again, back to quality by design, what makes the most sense to your trial, and how do you do this to make it worthwhile? So the first 4 recommendations that do fall in our design and methodology, these are, the one I just covered, that it's not all or nothing. You can do individual ones that make sense. We definitely hit that everything doesn't live in the healthcare system. And that's where the other work, all of our work is interconnected more and more as our organization has done. Decentralized trials may be a huge piece there. So, if you're doing a diabetes study that is trying to prevent hypoglycemia, that's not going to be in the standard chart unless it's like saying they have frequent hypoglycemia. You're going to need like a continuous glucose monitor. So that might not be, and even if that is in the chart, it might be in a way that isn't easily accessible. So you need ways to do things outside of the healthcare system. And that goes with the second one too, assess whether the clinical trial elements should be embedded. Does it make sense? That, do you even have the patient population where you're going to conduct it that you need? And that's both these recommendations are 2 or 3. But you really are aiming to lessen that duplication, but you want to say which one of these are feasible. And you also want to validate the reliability of clinical data. And I loved hearing that this morning about the features of essential real-world data. So that this really would be that piece of verifying that it's usually there. So do you know you're going to do a cancer-embedded trial? Here's the 10 things that were discussed that are typically in your data in Canada across all your provinces. And if your trial's measuring those, then it probably is a potential candidate for it. But if it's in those iffy categories, maybe you would look to collect it in another way. And again, this streamlining trial design to align with clinical workflows. So where can clinicians do it? Where can you have, modular add-ons or pop-ups, and you can have clinicians be part of it? Or where are you going to have your research team on standby? There's some places where you could train providers to do informed consent, but there's other places where that might not be feasible, and you might have a coordinator come to wherever the care setting is when they see that there's a patient who might be eligible. So we really want to reduce that. And you want to consult that this patients come into this place as well, where consulting all of your stakeholders. Do the patients even want to do it? Are they okay with their data being used? Do they like the idea of not having to have their research be separate from this? Or the two being intermingled. So really consulting with patients up front as well. All right. And this is the operational recommendations, and these are, ensuring site readiness to embed trials. And as we mentioned, this comes into play with the what does the site need? What kind of research training do they need? In one of our IRB studies, we talked a lot about who is engaged in research. So do you need to cover them? It was actually about that. Like, do these people need to be key personnel on an ethics approval? But it's the same concept here. Like, who in the healthcare system actually is engaged in research. And if they're not engaged in research, they're just doing a collection that's part of standard care, then you don't have to make them do strenuous GCP, time-consuming GCP training. You can say if you're conducting MRIs and that's what you do anyway, you can incentivize them and make them part of the team, but you do not have to have them be officially part of the research team. Which means you don't have to make them do official GCP training. So, but then where you do want people, do you want to build that capacity? Maybe that's something that you slowly do. You get people trained. I loved the associate investigators that were talked about this morning. That's a great way to get your infrastructure built up. You want to communicate with the healthcare systems to determine how technology solutions can facilitate and meet both research and clinical needs. So again, that gets into like, do they have it? Can they share it? All of those things. Even if the clinical staff isn't engaged, you want to make sure that they are aware of the study and are collecting the things you need. And again, I've mentioned already that providing that support staff so that people aren't overwhelmed. And automate what you can. We've got some great partners in some of our academic members who do really amazing things with their patient care portals, the MyChart and Epic and whatever the Cerner counterpart is it. So you can log on, and that also helps with outside of research hours, that you could get people to say they might be interested in research and consent to be contacted about research, and then you can also contact them about particular research. And if you do it in a portal, it doesn't always have to be 9 to 5, and then the research coordinator can, or the clinical care provider can provide them later. And you also can do quality assurance checks. So we really, it's part of our quality by design, but it also comes in this, is that risk-based monitoring is really big. So when you're validating the quality of research, you might, in your last stage, you know that it's there and it should be there, but you should do feasibility assessments once you get your actual population of participating healthcare system sites, and really do that feasibility assessment of, can you pull it? Is it there? What are the things you should monitor more often? And then finally, this healthcare and research culture. So you want to recognize and invest in research activities and promote the basis for ways to embed. So really, this is that culture change. You want to prioritize research participation. Pippa's presentation this morning about when she said, I have a day where I do this, that you give people and you pay people time to do it. We also heard from people that it might not even go that far, but it might be other things where maybe to participate in research, you give credits in some other way, like continuing education credits or something. If they don't have a major role, but their role is critical, you might do something, short of full salary support, or maybe but something that is also very, very valuable to busy clinicians. You want to collaborate to build stronger digital and financial infrastructures. So a lot of these trials that have been successful at this, especially in places that don't have a nationalized healthcare system, you have to build the system that collects the data. The VA has done that. I mean, the VA is the closest thing I think we have to our nationalized system, but they have spent years building a central data warehouse. And again, those data standards are really important, and developing communication plans for how everybody will work together. And our government people come in play here too. The FDA is really committed to, I'm not speaking for them, but they've released so many documents about modernizing clinical trials, about real world data. We know they're supportive of this, but continuing to talk about it, sharing examples where it's been used for regulatory approval will be really helpful. So our supporting resources that we have 5 case examples. Several of these were mentioned today, and that reflect how people have done this and how they have embedded parts of trials, and we say which they are, so it really supports that not all or nothing either, like which elements were. So if you go to our website, this summary is in the recommendations document, but if you go to our website, you can read the case studies from each of these trials. the recovery trial clearly is an example we heard lots about today. That along with TASTE and did happen in countries that have the nationalized healthcare system. The VA is sort of a cross between that. They are our closest thing. But there are examples where people have done this not in that case. REMAP-CAP had a US site, so we can do this. With the EHR has made it possible for us to do this in the United States. But it's not a coincidence that where we've been able to do it is because there's been really significant investment in the data infrastructure to pull data in. So iSpy, that's coordinated out of San Francisco, and they both did COVID studies, but they were able to switch and do COVID studies because they've been doing breast cancer studies for a while in a platform methodology. So they had that infrastructure, they had the technology support, they knew how to pull EHR data into studies, and that was a significant investment that was supported by both private and government funds in order to build that. So we do need those things in order to make it successful. Another supporting research that's in development for us is the embedding trials in feasibility assessment tool. So some of the things we talked about, like do you even have the patients at your site? Do you have the information technology resources to do this, all of that. Each part of the recommendations, we are developing a feasibility assessment tool that sites can look at, and sponsors. It is a combo of sites and sponsors. So stay tuned for that being a tool that goes along with these recommendations. And I want to thank our participants. So we had our research participants, those in-depth interview participants. We have our expert meeting attendees, and our recommendations advisory committee. The research participants, we don't have those public, they're anonymized, but the expert meeting attendees and the recommendations advisory committee members are on our website if people are interested in who participated in those. The expert meetings are also on our website, so if you wanted to dig into those case studies being presented, dig into more of our research results, those were presented at a May 2022 meeting, and so all of the slides from those meetings, and as well as the agenda and the participant list, are available on our website. And this is our team. So as I mentioned, we have our multi-stakeholder team. We have as I mentioned, we had someone from Friends of Cancer Research. We had our patient advocacy group as our team leads, and also several patient advocacy organizations on our project team. Lindsay Kehoe is the expert in this space on our team, but she speaks so much about this that I'm here to talk about it, although Lindsay is a key part of my project team. And as I mentioned, our social science team as well that conducted the research. You can download the recommendations at our website, so that is available there. One of the things that we developed in the last few years is a case study exchange. So it's different from our case studies for this project. It's specifically people who've used our recommendations and developed something from it or implemented them within an organization. We have 50 of those. We don't yet have trials and clinical practice ones, but if anybody uses our recommendations, let us know. We can write one up. We have, and we write it up with participation. So we always want to let people know the burden is minimal on people who are contributing. Something that's coming, lots of things that are coming soon for us. We have a manuscript that really in detail will describe everything I talked about today. That's been submitted. That'll be available soon. That engaging all stakeholders in trial design will be available next year, so stay tuned for that roadmap. It'll be a web-based roadmap that lets people walk through those steps and what research is available to engage all stakeholders in trial design. We do have a new project. I mentioned that we don't have a long list under our patient engagement space, but we will have a new one that we're in our earliest stages now. It was voted on our members, which is patient access and flexibility in clinical trials. So really combines this project and decentralized clinical trials and how do we make things more flexible. We don't know exactly the focus in our landscape stage. The other thing we do is collaborate with other public-private partnerships and other initiatives to find out what everybody else is doing, and that's what we're doing right now, is like, where can we fit and do the most impactful project with our membership? And then, as I mentioned, those metrics in the beginning are metrics for measuring trials transformation. So if you're interested in any of those or our other work, sign up for our newsletter, so it's there. Our website is listed. We also have a public workshop on enhancing clinical study diversity, and there was a Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act that came out in the end of last year, and it required meetings, and so we're working with our FDA colleagues to host this. So that's the registration QR code there. Or it's also on our website. If you look at City News, you can get to a site where you could register if you're interested in attending that. So I will stop there and answer any questions.
Sara, maybe I'll start with a question,
Sure.
which is that congratulations on the engagement and dialogue with a vast ecosystem of multi-stakeholders. In the spirit of driving adoption, in the spirit of putting one step in front of the other, is there any kind of sense of, was one group more willing to adopt, willing to run towards the adoption of these guidelines versus another? I'm just trying to get a feel for, who is at the top of the list and who can really push this forward versus people who are willing but not now, or just a prioritization of that multi-stakeholder audience.
Yeah, I mean, and lots of people made this point today, anyone who does research, and it's hard, it's like, and if you work for a group like I do, we're all trying to make work, so we're on board, we're trying, and people who are tired of how long research takes and how redundant it is, so often people who are in the space, I would say the hardest thing is how separate everything is. So like that, it's not necessarily that the ideal of it isn't, but they're two separate systems, care and clinical trials, and we've got to figure out how to integrate those. So that's what the ACT at POC group is trying to do, and that's actually run out of Duke Margolis so some of our colleagues, our project manager, Lindsay Kehoe, is actively involved in trying to see how we can use our recommendations to engage with those payers and health systems. So I'm not going to disparage anyone for not being supportive, but I think it's really just how we need to make the case and do it. I mean, and again, I wouldn't say COVID is a positive thing, but there are silver linings, and people can shift and integrate into clinical care when we all have a common mission, but we need people to remember that and keep those things going. And not have that. There's lots of things, even decentralized trials, where you can sort of feel it slipping to people going back to the old ways of doing things. And I think with this and with decentralized trials and anything that we showed was possible and more efficient, we want to capitalize on those things before people remember how it worked.
Thanks, Sara. I'm really looking forward to workshopping those recommendations tomorrow. I was just thinking, I was looking at the list of examples of use of some of those recommendations. Mm-hmm. Have you experienced as of yet sort of a small pilot project where it's been tested, maybe in sort of one center with maybe a satellite of other centers around it in the community? Have people started to look at that as a possibility of sort of feeling the way into it as yet?
I think, I mean, other than the big things like I Spy COVID and like platform trials have been trying to do more of this all along. So those are sort of varying size of people who've been successful in platform trials. The NIH Collaboratory, the Health Systems Collaboratory, they've existed for about 10 years. Or over 10 years at this point, and they have, one of the big things they did was case examples of trials that were embedded in healthcare. So that's, I would refer people there, both for they've created, a whole learning library about how trials can be embedded into clinical care, but also example studies. And they have feels like I'm advertising for them, but they are also my colleagues. And some of them are former colleagues of mine, but they have a Friday webinar where they often do exactly that. They present examples. So some of those examples are, big healthcare systems in the US, like Kaiser and places who were part of that health systems collaboratory network, where they have conducted different trials where they've done that. Most all of them are comparative effectiveness post-market research, but they definitely are those examples. So that's where I would refer people to go. Or even check in on Fridays if you want to once in a while at 1 o'clock. They have those webinars where I tune in when I can to get those, exactly that recommendations. So I won't try to remember specific examples, but there are several like that have done it. And usually not tiny pilots, but like health system pilots, where people are, so some of them are decent sized.
Yeah, and I was also thinking from the data point of view, on the EMR systems and so forth, they may not necessarily be collecting the data that is required for the clinical trial. So how did they adapt? Did they have a new data set that was downloaded, or like how did they adapt with the necessary additional data requirements?
I mean, it's trial dependent, but I think that's where the, conducting trials that collect only the data that you need, and trying, if you're going to embed it and it's appropriate to embed, trying to design that around things that are available. And that may be why if you're going to completely embed it, may be more suited to, at least in the US, like late phase and post-market research, because you don't have to collect as much safety data. It's not gonna be but some of the examples, both for these types of trials and registry type trials and so it might not be your EHR, it might be that you have a registry that's embedded in your healthcare. Registries in the US have done an amazing job being embedded in healthcare, where providers are used to that because they want to see their benchmarking. So they've already done that, and when they've conducted residency the only thing they had to add on was a few things that weren't collected at the right intervals in the registry, so they did some modular add-ons to the registry, or randomization was new. So, some of those trials, the SAFE PCI trial is an example of that, where they did, embedded randomization, and then they did have those add-ons and did have coordinators to do some of the data. So it's that not all or nothing. They got most of it from the registry, and then they had coordinators to, even if it was the registry-based coordinators, to collect that extra data that wasn't in that. But there are places that have been successful in doing it that way, in adding on.
Thank you.
Okay. Sara, thank you so much for setting the stage. That was a lot of information for
Yes.
sure.